this is round 2. I don't think I recognized my opponent here, so well, let me actually see if what Goldfish would have shown. I think with these vintage events, players tend to, at least a lot of players tend to play the same decks. Yeah, this player had no vintage results, so there's really not much to go by, and so it's dangerous to make too much of a read, obviously. So I did not, but I think this hand is keepable. It makes a fast Lurrus plus bobble. I get a bobble myself on turn 1. I have a dig that's not that far off from being cast, as well as it's easy food for the force, so I keep it. I bobble myself. I see a swords. This is super interesting, because if I knew my opponent were on a Tinker deck, I don't particularly want the swords. Now, some Tinker decks, many Tinker decks right now, play Hole Breacher, and some play Opposition Agent. There are some swords targets. A fast Mentor kill is really spooky from some of the Tinker decks. So having swords is fine against the field, but in particular, if my opponent is on, say, aggro shops, or has a shop straw with the Golem, Lodestone Golem, or Revoker on Jet, or if they're a Bazaar deck, I'm going to really want this swords. So I think it's right to leave it. And it looks like that's what I choose to do. I'll draw the swords, and my opponent casts Once Upon a Time. I struggle with this, with when to counter the Once Upon a Time. I think if my opponent were on 5 or 4 cards, I would probably counter it. I think on 6, it's just too likely that they have a Bazaar in hand already, and that I need to be saving this Force of Will for a hollow one or something. That's my concern here. So I let it go, and they get Stitcher Supplier, which actually implies some really interesting things. It means they're on a Hogaak deck rather than it's still a Bazaar deck, but the focus is around turning on Vengevine via Hogaak rather than maybe they don't have as many Hex Drinkers, maybe they have a little bit, their mana is a little more stable, but it comes at the costs of some of the more explosive cards in the deck, I guess. But for the most part, it's still a Bazaar Lizard Vengevine deck. But then they lead on bad lands too, which again implies, I don't know what it implies. It could just be red mana for the Root Wallows. It could be something a little more interesting. But my opponent plays a Deathrite Shaman. I just, no nonsense, just get this out of here. Deathrite Shaman's not the most threatening creature, but it does just enough. My opponent's already down to 5 cards. I have a force for whatever they play next if I need to. I really just want to turn the corner here and start accruing some advantage so I can close the game out. I draw Ragavan. Interesting. I can't cast it yet. I mean, I could cast it if I wanted to off the Misty, but I want to save that Misty as long as possible in case I draw Brainstorm. It also protects my red source this turn in case they have a Wasteland. So I just call up Lurrus and say go. It went fast. Okay, so my opponent played Wasteland and wasted a Tundra, which I think from my opponent's point of view, I mean, maybe it makes sense. I mean, if they don't have another colored mana source, like what are you doing at that turn anyway? But this is just... This kind of shows the problem with trying to fight this Lurrus deck on that angle. I just have a land Lurrus Bobble, and what is my opponent going to do to that, right? So I think there's some interesting consideration for Mystical Tutor into Ancestral, but that's kind of weak, or at least it's a little exposed to Mental Misstep. And I could just brick off the Ancestral. Like, why not just, get my draw engine on board, get a little bit of information. Now I'll basically see most cards that my opponent's draws for the rest of the game, and I can act with pretty clear intentions. Citrus Supplier, don't really care. And they don't mill over anything of note. They could potentially have a Hogaak off a Dryad Arbor. They could have a Hogaak off of another Citrus Supplier, but they just have a Lizard. Here I'm upkeep Mystical for Ancestral. Which one cards? And I found them. Bobble you. See the Vengevine. We're still there. They clearly don't have a Bazaar. Surely they're in the deck, but they don't have them here. And if they're not drawing a Bazaar next turn, I mean, I don't really care about any of this that's going on. And I take their Badlands just so that they can't attack with the Rootwalla. I honestly don't care about Badlands otherwise. I don't think it does any good for them. But I have this extra Wasteland in case they do eventually draw into Bazaar, and now my goal is just close the game out. And yeah, my opponent's had enough. They're not getting over this with drawing a Vengevine, and their hand is probably like a Vengevine and some other nonsense card. They're just off it. So game 2. Let's look at sideboarding too for these. So in the sideboard here, it looks like I boarded out the Probe. I boarded out the Force of Negation. I boarded out the one Flusterstorm. I boarded out the Pyroblasts. I boarded out both Ragavans. And I boarded down one Mishra's Bauble. And so then the cards I added here, it's actually just real quick here. So it looks like I added in 2 Tormod's Crypts. I added the Wasteland. I added what was the Prismatic Ending. I added both Swords to Plowshares, and I added the Tabernacle. And I think all of this stayed. Sometimes with these Hogaak decks or with the Bazaar decks, I bring in one Shattering Spree just as a hedge against the it's against specifically Hollow One. It's a better Swords to Plowshares. And sometimes it can have relevance against Chalice of the Void. It can have relevance against it can sometimes take them off of mana, off of Mox mana, so that you can Tabernacle them. I think having one copy in the 60 is actually a really good thing. I didn't put it in here. I think you can take or leave it. Hand's great, no notes. Get a turn 1 Mox, consider, have Swords up, like this is just the dream. Once Upon a Time off of a 7. And this is really, like, I won't say this for sure without knowing their hand, but knowing that my opponent kept a Taiga, a 7 with Taiga and no Bazaar, relying on Once Upon a Time, I just think you just can't do it with this deck. Your mulligans are too free when you have Bazaar in your deck, even for a deck like my opponent's that is built to function off of real mana. And is built to handle the non-Bazaar games. I can't imagine that this is the right way to go about it. But turn 1 Deathrite Shaman. Same thing's going to happen here. We're just not going to mess around and just get this thing off the board. I've been the Force of Will. I just don't like. Again, my opponent didn't play anything on turn 1 other than a Deathrite Shaman. I would rather use my Consider to dig for the other part of the Breach combo and just end the game, or a Tormod's Crypt. But here we just, no nonsense, take care of the creature. They use a Force of Vigor on both my things here. And that's interesting. One, I didn't get any value off of my Mox Jet. So that does signal maybe I shouldn't have played it. Right, I didn't tap it on any turn. But it's also, this is a really weak Force of Vigor. Like, my opponent doesn't know that I have a lot of mana here. So like I get it. but man, I was happy to see that. But they do have the Wasteland, so it is at least a coherent strategy. They took me off of 2 Moxes, and they made their Wasteland better. It turns out my hand just lined up really well against that. And now I don't strip mine them, because I don't care about their green stuff. I don't care about their creatures here as long as I can keep the Vengevines and the Hogaaks off the board. And the only card that does that for me is strip mine if they have a Bazaar. So I get the island. I think I keep this Tundra. Yeah, keep the Tundra because that's the only way I'm going to be able to cast this Lurrus. Because of my decisions to, one, I exposed a non-basic to Wasteland, and I chose to get the island. This Tundra is essentially necessary to cast my Lurrus. And because of that, I don't want to expose it to Wasteland here, so I will much prefer to play a strip mine. This does let them, if they have a Wasteland, they can, you know, if they wanted to, they can waste me out. They choose to go after my island again, which I don't know. I get why they want to. It's just gonna backfire, and maybe backfire in predictable ways. So my opponent fetching Dryad Arbor here just means that I think this is a pretty safe signal to me that they have a Hogaak in their hand. The chip damage is not going to matter all that much. They're unlikely to tap, you know, just like tap it for green to make something. I felt like they're doing this to power out a Hogaak, but at the same time, you can do that without cracking your fetch, and this exposes it to strip mine. So I'm not really sure whether this was a thoughtful strategy or if my opponent was just taking game actions. So I guess this is kind of interesting. I could have called up Lurrus, but that's really vulnerable to another Wasteland. If they tag my Tundra, my problem here, I have 1 Tundra here, 1 Tundra here. There's only 1 more Tundra left in the deck. So if they tag this Tundra, all of a sudden I am only drawing to this Jet that's in the graveyard already, or the Pearl that's in my deck to even cast the Lurrus. So I go for a Breach. And let's see what a value Breach here is just really good. So I get at least 2 Mox. Yeah, I get Jet. So this is kind of cool. So my opponent uses another force here. This kind of explains their plays here thus far. They're covered against the combo kill, and so I guess that's that plus functional mana led them to keep. I think their hand probably should have been a mulligan going through this, but you know, I don't see the full details. So here, what I need to do, there's 2 things. One is I need to crypt them. By crypting them, it will remove some Hogaak food. But then I need to cast something right here. Because once this Breach is gone, all these instants are no longer castable. So I cast the Swords to Plowshares on their Dryad Arbor, I think. Yep. And then I'll crypt you. And the Breach dies. But what's neat now is that because Jet resolved, now I have that second Lurrus source. So now I can cast it on board. I cycle a hollow one, which I guess I can buy that. Stitcher Supplier hits nothing. It's a pair of Ruwalas. Okay. Now things are starting to come together. I don't know that there's a wrong way to play this. I think I lead with the iteration. I'm in such good shape here that with 1 card in hand, even if my opponent had, like, say, Vengevine, and drew into Bazaar, Bazaar'd into Vengevine plus Lizard, and somehow hit a Hogaak, I think I'm still favored against that with Breach, Lurrus, and Time Walk in hand. So I can afford to brick on my iteration. I think I want to lead with iteration, because that lets me go iteration into Time Walk, and that seems really good. And yeah, I basically just hit the, I say the nuts. I mean, it's hard to go too wrong here. I did not brick on lands, and I guess I played it a little safer. I just called up Lurrus this turn, setting up next turn going Lurrus, Time Walk, Bobble, or Lurrus, Time Walk, Crypt, and then Lurrus, Breach, win. I think that's how it plays out. As a second Stitcher Supplier, nothing they do here matters. They can hit a Hogaak. They do hit a Hogaak. They play their Hogaak. But I have swords. I have Breach. I have Lurrus. There's no way for this to proceed in which my opponent has any agency. So I just drew another Breach too. So I play Lurrus. Yeah. Do some things. Untap. Oh, and then now I do everything. But again, my opponent's not getting another turn here, right? Rather, they're not getting another turn until I've fully expended my graveyard. So the first thing I would do here, Lotus, play Breach, doesn't matter which one, and then start casting, cast Iteration, cast Time Walk, and I have enough to cast Iteration and Time Walk this turn. I'll probably have enough, especially with these waste lands, to be able to cast Time Walk and maybe even Iteration again the following turn. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 8, 9. I can at least cast 3 spells without eating into my critical cards. And from this spot here, casting Time Walk twice and Iteration once, along with another round of turn cycle, there's no coming back from this. So pretty easy round 2. After this point, I was 2-0 and feeling great about the event. It's always nice to start off with wins. So I hope to see you back here for round 3.